everyone. Welcome back to the In the Lab stage at AI UK 2022. Next up, we've got an absolutely brilliant panel, an esteemed panel, to talk all about the role of AI in the early detection of diseases. Your host is Carina Namih, General Partner at Episode 1 Ventures and Board Member at the Alan Turing Institute. Without further ado, over to you, Carina.
Thank you so much, Gemma, and hello, good morning. So we have an absolutely killer set of speakers for you today, and I'm going to keep it simple and have them introduce themselves. Maybe, Chris, you could go first.
Sure. Chris Wigley, I'm the Chief Executive at Genomics England, and before that was at Quantum Black, which is a sort of machine learning outfit that's now owned by McKinsey.
And I'm David Crosby. I'm the Head of Prevention and Early Detection Research at Cancer Research UK, with strong interests in AI, machine learning, data science to enable the earlier detection of disease.
And over to our virtual panellists. Jeanette, maybe you could go first. Oh, it seems they might not be able to hear us. Okay, I will introduce myself. So I am a venture capital investor. I invest in early stage businesses, many of which are applying AI to healthcare. I also founded a business in the RNA vaccine space that relied heavily on AI to develop our therapies. And the topic today is using AI for the early detection of disease, which oh, I can see a nod. It looks like our virtual panelists can hear us now. So perhaps Jeanette could go ahead and introduce herself.
Hey, good morning. Yes, you can hear now. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeanette Kusel. I'm the Acting Interim Director for Medtech and Digital at NICE.
Fantastic. And maybe Ben could introduce himself?
Yes, great. Thanks for having us. I'm Ben Glocker. I'm an academic at Imperial College London in the Department of Computing, where research group at the intersection of artificial intelligence and medical imaging. And I also come with an industry hat today. I'm also the head of ML research at Chiron Medical Technologies.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'm going to start by lobbing it over to you, David, and ask if you could help us understand the essay question a bit more. So AI for early detection of disease. Could you help us frame that, maybe give us some things to think about?
Sure. Well, I think it's increasingly recognised that in many diseases, the earlier you can pick that disease up, the likelier you are to be able to treat it successfully and ameliorate its consequences and extend lives. But it's a challenge. Most diseases present late with symptoms, and by that point, often the damage is quite advanced, and the disease has become intractable, which is very much the case in cancer. So the great hope is early detection, and we have an array of interesting technologies, things like imaging and blood tests and so on, where we're beginning to kind of get a foothold to be able to do that. But the more technologies we apply, the increasing magnitude of the data that's generated when you're characterising a person. And when you're trying to do early detection, you are essentially testing people whom you don't know whether or not they have a disease, i.e. you're testing ostensibly healthy people to try and pick up the very early stages when it's not symptomatic. That means characterising healthy people in as many ways as you can with as much data as you can to try and find the signals. And it's, in my view, the magnitude and multiple modalities of data are getting beyond the abilities of individual humans to parse and spot patterns of signal, which speaks to the essential nature of data science and advanced data analytics to be able to spot those signals.
Yeah, it's interesting. And Jeanette, I would imagine in your role you're thinking a lot about some of the practical implications of applying these technologies in a system like the NHS.
Yeah, that's right. So NICE looks at the clinical and cost effectiveness of technologies, including digital technologies and those that have embedded AI. So we're really interested in how do these actually work? What's the evidence that sits behind some of these technologies? Can we be sure that they're actually going to be beneficial for patients and the healthcare system? And also, what are they going to cost to the healthcare system, both in terms of the actual purchase cost of the product, which probably isn't going to be huge for a lot of these digital products. But then what are also the follow-on costs of identifying disease early and mapping out that whole cost and effectiveness of employing these technologies to detect disease early?
Great. I think that's a really important lens to consider when we're talking about some of this stuff, where there's a huge amount of potential, but I think translating that into application is often really challenging. What do you think, David? Sorry, Chris.
So I think Dave mentioned this point about the massive expansion of all of these different data sets. So at Genomics England, we're looking obviously at the genome, all of the DNA in our bodies, and there's 3.2 billion base pairs in our DNA. And so to the point about human interpretation, I don't know if anyone has seen those sort of TED Talks or photos of what a human genome looks like when it's printed out.
Pages and pages.
Volumes and
Shelves of
volumes.
books.
Right? It looks remarkably like the sort of 36-volume version of the Oxford English Dictionary.
Yeah.
And it would take more than a lifetime to even read it, let alone figure out what's going on there. So we're immediately into the world of advanced data analytics and so on. And for us, that complexity is expanding quite rapidly along two dimensions. So one dimension is more and more different types of molecular insights. So if we think back to the sort of fundamental dogma of biology about DNA encodes RNA, which makes proteins, we have all of the DNA for the patients and research participants we work with. For many of them, we're now sequencing their RNA as well. For many of them, we're now looking at high abundance and low abundance proteomics. We're starting to look at metabolomics. And so, that's one dimension of just incredible complexity right there. But then you think about actually, what are the other modes of data that are relevant here? Because we know that our DNA is not definitive, and it interacts with the environment and with other things that, a DNA outcome in one part of our body can interact with another in another. So we're also looking at imaging. We're also looking at data associated with like social determinants of health, like air pollution or deprivation, at clinical data and things like cancer registry data in that field. So the only way that we can make meaningful predictions, like what is wrong with this person, or what is the best therapeutic to help this person, or how can we design a new drug or a new vaccine to help everyone, is by using these techniques around data analytics, machine learning, AI.
I wonder if actually sometimes our ability to detect runs faster than our ability to intervene and to treat. Is that something that you are encountering and that you consider in your roles?
Yes, absolutely. It's something that needs thought, but which in my view shouldn't discourage us from trying. So there are certainly diseases out there, like, for example, Alzheimer's, or in my world, brain cancers, where even when you find them slightly earlier in the disease course, they're still currently quite intractable. They're hard to treat. We don't have necessarily the drugs that treat them effectively. So some folks would take I suppose a fairly nihilistic view of there's no point doing the research to try and detect those ones early. I would say quite the contrary, in that it will only be through detecting them early and then characterising them and understanding their biology that we'll be able to innovate the treatments that will help them in the future.
Yeah.
So that should be a key goal.
And just at a human level, a diagnosis can be so important, particularly, we've touched on cancer. We do a lot of work with patients and participants in the rare disease space, who've often gone through a diagnostic odyssey of many years, seen lots of different specialists, lots of different consultants. No one's quite sure what's going on. And actually getting to a diagnosis through techniques like whole genome sequencing or others is transformational at a human level for that person, that family. One of the mums of a sick kid who we worked with, very kindly, they offered to be a sort of case study for how this works. And when she was on video talking about it, she was incredibly moving, talking about the diagnosis, because she had said, well, we had this kid and he was so beautiful and wonderful, and then these developmental issues appeared, and we kept on thinking that we had done something wrong. And actually the diagnosis kind of freed us from that sense of guilt, because we knew it was like it was caused by just a glitch in his DNA. And so as human beings, we can just tie ourselves in knots about these things. thankfully, in that case, the kid, Owen, had a condition to do with his thyroid, which was treatable. But even in a case when it's not treatable, having a diagnosis means you know the enemy. You can often form communities around that. You can start fundraising for research. And there are more and more really incredibly cutting-edge techniques, often using AI, to get to kind of N of 1 or small n treatments for these rare and kind of crippling conditions. So I think we definitely want to get beyond diagnosis to treatment, but even diagnosis itself is hugely powerful often.
And also in the experience of Cancer Research UK, patients are incredibly altruistic when it comes to themselves and their data being used for research, which isn't necessarily going to benefit them, knowing that this could benefit the next person to get diagnosed or future generations, and they want that to happen.
That's fantastic. Jeanette.
Just to offer a kind of counter perspective to Chris's view on the patient centric element. We know that not all cases an early diagnosis is a good thing for patients if there is no follow-on treatment, to routinely offer some of these diagnostics in the NHS and have significant numbers of people knowing that they have risk factors or conditions that we then can't actually do anything about can increase anxiety in patients as well. And it differs between different areas, and it probably differs between different patients as well. But there is that counter view that needs to be taken into consideration. And I completely agree with David's point that doesn't mean that this research shouldn't be done, but there needs to be that research opportunity for patients. If they know they have a condition, then they could be saying enter research studies if we can't offer them something routinely on the NHS.
If I may add something on that, because I think this is really important. I mean, I would like to highlight we're not trying to introduce new technologies like AI for the sake of technology, right? It's not about bringing in fancy new tech into clinical practice. It's about addressing a clinical need. And I think, for instance, Chiron working on breast cancer screening is a great example where AI or new technology can help and address real needs. We have a workforce crisis. We have the need to work through a backlog. The pandemic, for instance, has caused huge issues in our current clinical workflows. We know, for instance, in breast cancer screening, have women that missed for maybe 2 years their regular checkups, their screening process. So we do know there's a huge backlog that needs to be looked at. And at the same time, we know that because of missed screening appointments, we have already cases out there where cancer has developed to a later stage. So people presenting now in screening programs will more likely have possible malignancies. And I think going through this and using latest technology to address this need is important. But at the same time, I'm with Jeanette here that there needs to be the right evidence that this technology can actually address the right clinical needs.
And I think it comes back to what's relevant and helpful, right? So I completely agree. The kind of diagnoses I was talking about is when someone is already sick and we're trying to figure out what's going on. The flip side of that would be, we've just been funded and it's been announced in Parliament around we're doing a project where we'll be sequencing 100,000 newborn babies to try and spot highly penetrant, i.e. caused by your DNA, conditions that are early onset and really harmful for these kids and for which there is a treatment. We'll be sequencing their whole genome, and the ethics is now very clear. We could look at other areas of the genome and say, what do we think your risk of cancer is? But why would we do that? This is something that may or may not happen when someone is 40 or 50. It's all statistics. It's completely unhelpful. Whereas saying, actually, for this small proportion of those kids who do have highly penetrant, damaging, and treatable early onset conditions, that's transformative and relevant. And in this case, the parents have made an informed choice about, yes, we want to get this information. No one is even suggesting, saying to them, oh, and by the way, here's your kid's risk of this type of cancer or that type of cancer or this type of heart disease or whatever. It has to be driven by patient choice. We have to work with patients to figure out what the right questions to ask are, and then we have to kind of co-develop that together.
Yeah, I suppose the semantics are really important, right? There's sort of risk assessment at one end of the spectrum, and then there's diagnosis,
Yeah.
and there's sort of screening
Yeah.
lies somewhere in the middle. And I think with new technologies, there's so much potential to apply it across the board, and there are a lot of challenges, including the ethical ones. Where do you apply the focus, and where do you apply the research funding?
Yeah.
So Ben, I'd love to pull you in a little bit more and understand what are some areas that you're excited about in your work where you think that we could really see an impact of this technology sooner rather than later?
I think we're at a really interesting time where we have evidence that new technology like AI, so my specialty is using machine learning for medical imaging, so detecting disease early in medical scans, is that we do have evidence that the technology does detect disease accurately, sometimes at the level of human experts, sometimes beyond. Now, the question is, how do we get that into clinical practice in a way that it actually has patient benefit? And I think what we are currently seeing is maybe a little bit of a tension between, of course, we need to be a bit conservative. We need to make sure that if we introduce the technology, it has to be safe, it has to be ethical, it should be fair, equitable, it should work for everyone, right? That we have in a screening population, for example. And I think what is interesting at the moment is to get to the point where we say, when is the evidence that we acquire in the lab about, for instance, retrospective studies on historical data, performance and accuracy evaluations, when is the evidence enough and sufficient to go to the next step? For instance, run a randomized controlled trial. And I think this is something where there is a hot debate, and it should be debated. It should be debated publicly. When do we have enough evidence to go to the next step? When is it safe to do a clinical trial, a prospective study? Because it will affect patients. I think the other thing that is important to note is it affects the clinical practice. So the practitioners, the nurses, the doctors, and the people who directly work with the patients in a really drastic way. We are asking a lot by saying, actually, in your normal routine, you should also help us run this clinical trial and assess a new technology and give us evidence whether it works or not. I think this needs to be discussed more on how are we going to fund this? How are we going to support the current clinical practice? With the addition to actually, we need to test new technology. I think this is an important point.
I can come in there, Ben. I love that you're talking about prospective studies, because actually a lot of companies that I've worked with over the last year or 18 months, they've done their retrospective validation of their AI technology, and then they think that they can enter the NHS based only on their retrospective validation, and aren't thinking at all about prospective studies. It doesn't have to be randomized necessarily, but they're not even thinking about testing the technology in the hands of the clinicians or the patients, but often we're talking about the clinicians who are using them, and testing that kind of human AI interaction. Is it actually impacting on clinician decisions? How is it changing the treatment pathway when clinicians are they more confident in their decision? Are they actually treating patients quicker, earlier, better? And what the outpatient outcomes and the cost outcomes of that. And we're really not seeing that evidence coming through. So it's fantastic that some companies are thinking along that, because that is the evidence that we need. And it's nice we're developing. We have an evidence standards framework for digital health technologies that we've developed. We are currently developing a new iteration of that specifically incorporates the considerations around AI technologies and will help to answer Ben's question around what's the stage, what are the retrospective validation studies that you need to do before you can then enter the kind of prospective study stage, when you're actually testing it in real life with real clinicians and real patients.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, I can take the example from Carina. We're thinking a lot about how can we get to a stage of, for instance, a prospective trial, but ensuring patient safety at the same time, right? And the impact on clinical practice. And I think this can only be done together with initiatives that are like the NICE AI evidence framework, which is inviting feedback from all sides, which is important, and involving the patients, of course. But I think here it's also important to think a little bit creatively. I don't think we can always just think about the traditional retrospective, prospective, randomized controlled trial pathway. I think with this new technology, we have ways and new strategies for getting a transition where we can safely introduce technology, even in the background. We can have silent reader trials. We can have prospective, retrospective, mixed studies, which ensure patient safety, which is really important. And then once we have the next step and enough evidence, we can go safer, I think, to the full deployment.
Sort of build on that point. I mean, these are crucial issues. It might be interesting just to sort of draw out the difference for a second between early detection of disease and early diagnosis of disease. Yeah. And in the setting of diagnosis, where you have a patient who's come in, they've experienced some early symptoms, and you want to find out what's wrong with them. Let's say you're trialing an AI approach to imaging interpretation, and they've come in with an abdominal pain. You think maybe they've got colorectal cancer, so you do an endoscopy, and you've got an AI algorithm that's going to do sort of interpret the visuals coming out of the endoscope to diagnose the disease. So in that setting, you're testing somebody with symptoms who is inherently at relatively high risk compared to a completely healthy person. So your study, even prospectively, can be relatively small, relatively constrained. And even that, as Ben was saying, is quite a leap to get from your retrospective data analysis to a prospective evaluation. Now, if you want to go into screening, into genuine early detection, i.e. testing ostensibly healthy people, to see whether or not they've got a hidden, latent disease. Suddenly you're talking about people without symptoms who are at way lower risk. Yeah. So the number of people you need to then test there expands exponentially. And so suddenly, for a prospective study of a screening approach, you need to test tens of thousands of healthy people to find enough cases to know whether your technology even detected early. And then you're also going to want to know, did detecting early actually save any lives? In which case, you then, if you're doing it prospectively, having to test enough people so that enough people die in the control unscreened group to know if there was a difference, which takes not only huge numbers, but a very long time. Yeah. So getting to prospective studies there is hard. Doing the prospective study is even harder because it has to be, 10 years long with however many thousands of people. And that's a huge barrier. With the added problem for AI-based approaches, that by the time you finish your 10-year study of did this approach save lives, the technology is totally obsolete and it's all moved on, and you're back to square one. So it's a real challenge.
There's an interesting genomics angle on this because, exactly as you say, that's why we're doing 100,000 newborn babies, right, to try and validate this concept of actually screening for these rare, highly damaging conditions at birth is worthwhile, both from a patient perspective and from Jeanette's point about health economics and so on. Interestingly, if we leave epigenetic complications to one side for a second, our DNA is largely static through our life. So one of the things we're doing in parallel with recruiting, discussing this with, and sort of sequencing 100,000 newborn babies is looking at sequencing cohorts of people who are now 10, 16, 25, who give you, to some extent, the truth set of, okay, this person also has this glitch in their DNA. Did that pan out? Did they actually get that disease or not? And if not, what are the confounding factors and so on? So yeah, all of these perspectives need to come together to validate that. But I think just to pick up on the points about validation and the evidence base and actually getting things into the hands of clinicians, so important. And in my former role at Quantum Black, we were deploying machine learning AI in all sorts of contexts, like Formula One racing, wind turbines, mining, banking, whatever. AI in healthcare has a really specific context, and it's a really challenging and complex context, right? And so I think one of the things that I really reflect on of kind of quote-unquote doing AI in this setting is sometimes, quite often, the hard things are the easy things, and the easy things are the hard things. Actually, we can employ rocket scientists to do rocket science, and they're really good at their job, and they can kind of crack on with it. If we want all of the cancer surgeons across the country to do biopsies in a way that make them amenable to both imaging for Ben and sequencing for us and other ways, they need to freeze them rather than formalin fix them. Then you need 500 freezers in different hospitals, right? Where do the freezers go? There's no plug. It's literally that kind of thing that can completely trip you up. Or like the famous example of the Streams app from DeepMind Health. The AI worked fine, but there was no Wi-Fi in the wards. So the alerts didn't ping properly because the practitioners who had the app on their phone, the phone wasn't connected to the Wi-Fi because there was no Wi-Fi. To some extent, it's about freezers, extension cords, and Wi-Fi to make AI work in healthcare, rather than building yet more complex algorithms.
Yeah, you realise that this isn't an abstract science. This is
Yeah.
very practical.
It's a contact sport.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that the trust element is also so crucially important, because we are introducing potentially a black box to very, very human decisions, human issues, questions where we want to feel comfortable that we've had a person, a doctor, a specialist look at, making that decision for us rather than a machine. So I think that's a massive topic that people in our industry are grappling with.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
people are thinking about it. Sorry.
Ben, please
I
go.
was just about to say people are thinking very hard about this, and I wanted to add that angle, because if you think so we mentioned the difference between detection and diagnosis. So screening is a lot about detection, and the diagnosis comes later, and screening is voluntary. So you have to be really careful that you get this right. Introducing new technology comes with concerns, and also raises questions. You don't want to have a situation where you introduce something that people mistrust, or that decreases the trust in a screening program, and people wouldn't show up for screening anymore. And we already know that we have disparities. Certain groups of the population are attending screening programs less than others. So how can we think about using the technology to maybe even increase the trust? How can we make it in a way that people have a better experience attending screening programs? And I think this is important to think about as well. At the same time, taking the concerns very serious. There are great studies that ask women, for instance, if they would be happy with AI being used within mammography screening. And generally, the responses are positive as long as there's human oversight. So we need to think about ways of leveraging the best combination of human expertise and new technology.
I agree with that completely. Sorry.
Go ahead.
So I was going to. We've discussed a lot of the challenges, and I wanted to layer on a bit of optimism on top of Ben's. That absolutely, human trust in technology is paramount, and I think the developers of these technologies need to factor that consideration in from the outset, and that's trust of members of the public and patients, but also of the clinicians who are going to be using those technologies to support their decisions. And the optimism for me is that I think we all recognise that even before COVID, the NHS is under a lot of strain, time pressures, waiting lists. And the more we get better at early detection, the more load that actually adds into the system up front, because you're having to deal with more people. Now, hopefully there'll be some very positive back end to that, because if you're detecting people early, you'll treat them more successfully, and there'll be less long-term treatment and less negative outcomes to deal with for the system. So that should, in the long term, be cost saving. But for me, because of this sort of increasing need for diagnosis, the part of the solution has to be technological, to try and bring down the workload and demands on the human element of the NHS. Yeah. And so there's such a huge opportunity for AI technologies to be the triage system that helps the clinicians to bring down the workload. And it doesn't mean that the AI is deciding for them whether or not someone has disease and how to treat them. It means it's providing a screen that's, in Ben's world, that looks at your MRI scan or looks at your CT scan, and the machine does the first read and says, this is normal. Or you're not looking for the right thing here. And if there's something suspicious, it flags it up and says, this looks a bit off, and then it's the human that then decides that. what that cuts is the workload of the human having to look at every single negative scan. And again, in screening and in diagnosis, there's going to be more negative scans than there will be positive ones.
Yeah.
So if you can bring down that workload, we can really transform demands for time and resource in the NHS.
So it could be an incredibly cost-effective tool at our disposal.
Yes.
And then we can allocate resources much more effectively.
Absolutely. And that should be happening, in hand with the clinicians who are going to want this technology to help them, but that would have the trust in it to do the triage, whilst it's not threatening to cut them out of the loop.
Or increase their workload massively. Yeah.
We talk about the Harry Potter sorting hat model of AI. You put on the hat and it sort of says, I think this is going on. And then,
Right.
You can triage people that way, right? I mean, we touched on trust. I think another important word here is power. And one of the models that we've developed at Genomics England is that before any researchers, whether academic or from biotech and pharma, get access to the research data sets that we hold, they have to go through a thing called the Access Review Committee, on which sit representatives of the research participant whose data it is. It's their data, it's not our data. And they have an absolute veto. They can just say no. They don't have to have a reason. And actually, that is such a good system, because it's not just about we're going to listen to patients and participants, we're going to engage with them, which is important. But I think actually putting the control in their hands and saying, right, de facto, we're representing the people whose data this is, decisions that we make are made on their behalf. It just cuts a lot of concerns that people might legitimately have about how data is being used out of the system. And it massively reduces the risk that something is done which is inappropriate on that. So I think that we do need to talk about transparency, we do need to talk about engaging with different communities, with sick people, with well people, with underrepresented groups. We also have to talk about empowering them in a hard way, not in a soft way, with actual levers of power.
Yeah. It's interesting, I know we've talked about this in the past, that when you think about the ethics of these things, there's partly the responsibility to protect, but there's also partly the responsibility to treat and to enable and to make space for the possibilities of this technology. And I think sometimes we can be so focused on protecting interest groups or protecting norms that we've gotten used to that we can actually end up slowing down some of the possibilities of these technologies.
And it's always the participants who are saying to us, do more, do it faster. Obviously, do it in the right way.
Yeah.
But don't, help us to help you to make better decisions about how you can get more research happening on this data, not less.
Yeah, that's interesting. Jeanette, I wanted to come back to you. I think you had a view that you wanted to share.
Yeah, I was just building on the trust point. I completely agree with what's been said, and especially now at the moment, the technologies that we are seeing are those that have the human in the loop, that are the decision aids, the triage support tools, where there is a human at the end of it, a radiographer, a clinician making that final decision about what the actual diagnosis is or the risk is and the treatment options. And I think that is the right way of introducing it now to help build the trust. But we are seeing these technologies with quite good evidence showing that actually they are better than humans, some of them, at diagnosing and detecting. So I can see sort of 10, 20 years down the line, that we're not going to have the human in the loop anymore in some areas where there's good evidence that we don't need that, but that we're not ready to jump to that point yet where machines are just making these decisions and automatically whatever the machine says, that's the treatment output for patients. But that is the future. But we need to build that trust with the clinical community, with the patients who are being exposed to these technologies first, and that is going to take time.
And Jeanette, in your experience, what are some of the best practices around starting to translate these technologies from research, from the lab, and into real-world use? What are some of the things that you've seen done really well?
We've seen quite a few companies where, following the nice evidence standards framework, I would say that, wouldn't I? Where they're really thinking about what the impact of their technology is going to be on the healthcare system, which we've touched on already. What's the impact on the actual pathway? How is it going to be implemented in clinical practice? What are the access barriers? And testing those out and developing the evidence to show that they've overcome those barriers, that they understand who it is in the NHS that's actually going to be using their technologies, and developing studies to show that actually that the clinical outcomes, patient outcomes, cost outcomes are actually realised. And that's what the NHS is crying out for, is just that proof that actually the technologies that we're going to be implementing and paying for are actually going to deliver for patients and the healthcare system.
If I may, so we've talked a lot, very importantly, about the clinical context of how AI technologies might impact on patient care. There's of course a whole other world a bit further upstream.
Research.
Of the AI technologies having a tremendous impact on our ability to discover in research around early detection. So, for example, so there's been a lot of noise in the newspapers about blood tests, early detection blood tests for cancer.
Yeah.
You know, you take one little blood sample and they'll spot whatever, 50 different kinds of cancers in one go. So there's one particular technology being trialled in the NHS right now, and there are several other competing technologies being developed around the world. Several of those, the signals that they're testing for in the blood were derived from machine learning approaches.
Yeah.
So, in the olden days, in the Stone Ages when I was a lab scientist, a lot of signal finding was done in one's head, and you'd measure a bunch of stuff and you'd look at the data and you go, oh, that looks like a spike there, and you might do a sort of pairwise statistical test, but it was pretty much people spotting that. As exactly as Chris was saying, if you're looking at genomics, you're looking at kind of thousands of genes, millions of base pairs. If you're looking at stuff in the blood, you've also got a bunch of proteins, tens of thousands of proteins floating around, tens of thousands of metabolites, and there's no way that a human could spot a coherent pattern across that many indices, and that's where AI is already biting. So, for example, this cancer blood test that's being trialled in the NHS now, that keys off of epigenetic modifications of fragments of tumour DNA, so it's kind of patterns of methylation in little bits of DNA, broken bits of DNA floating around in the blood. And that's incredibly complex, and they're using that and saying not only we think you've got a cancer here, but we think you've got a pancreatic cancer here or a liver cancer. And those patterns would have been imperceptible to a human. So, in the research end, it's certainly already biting, and there's vast opportunities for AI to do even more in that space.
It'd be really interesting to hear more on the research end of the spectrum, where large data sets have sprung up whole new areas of research or of interest for the likes of Cancer Research UK. Is there a particular field where you find that the fact that these screening programs are happening means that you have all of this data to work with, where you may not have had a hypothesis to start with, but it's actually generating hypotheses for you?
Yeah, I mean, the genomics is the obvious example, in that 15 years ago it cost however many billions, to sequence a single human's genome.
It took thousands of humans lots of years.
Hundreds of thousands of person hours of effort and billions of dollars. And now, you can full sequence a human for $1,000, is it? Less?
Yeah. We're approaching the $100 genome.
Right. So, that has transformed our ability to look at the kind of molecular underpinnings of disease. So you asked kind of where's the exciting applications of that. Risk is quite interesting to me. So not spotting someone who has disease right now, but understanding who is at elevated risk of a particular disease. So if I know, for example, Carina, you're at a 10% elevated lifetime risk of ovarian cancer, then I might want to, give you an ultrasound once a year, whereas someone else with a much lower risk based on their genome, maybe I wouldn't screen them.
So I'd go on a different pathway.
Exactly,
as
yeah.
a result.
And so that's something that has enormous potential, and to get there, you're going to need the machine learning technologies to spot, the risk signals in the first place across the genome. And then you may also wish to integrate your genomic risk with the various other layers of information about you that confer risk. Your ethnic background, your socioeconomic status, people are at different levels of risk, your behaviours, do you smoke, do you drink, your diet, there's so many things about you that confer risk. But to get an integrated view across those, it's going to require some serious data analytics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a huge equity and bias issue there that I think we need to all kind of look in the face of as well. That there are these kind of well-known, almost kind of infamous examples within machine learning generally about things like facial recognition algorithms that are trained on 1 million white male faces, and guess what? They're useless at spotting people of colour, women accurately in the same way, because the training data set doesn't reflect the population that you're trying to use the algorithms for. Or the hiring algorithm that says, what do good engineers look like, and so therefore who should we hire, looks back at historic data and says, oh, all of the best engineers are male, because all of the engineers are male in this historic data set, so we should hire more men.
So the system ends up replicating the biases.
You end up replicating the biases of the system that you want to change, right? Yeah. So in the context of these types of personalized medicine approaches, or things like polygenic risk screening scores, rather, which we're talking about here, a lot of the data sets that those techniques were derived from are massively over-indexed on affluent European ancestry type people who are the most likely people to volunteer for those kinds of research programs. So we as a community need to really address that. One of the ways that we as Genomics England are doing that is through a program we're calling our Diverse Data Program, where for each of the ethnic groups and kind of different communities that we serve in England and the UK, we're making sure that we have kind of fully powered cohorts to be able to derive polygenic risk scores, to do a whole range of other approaches. Because as these things come into the mainstream, and you start saying, right, well, we're going to measure your level of cardiovascular risk, and maybe we'll actually even, we're a long way from this, but maybe even put you preemptively on statins on the basis of that risk. If those techniques only work accurately for people of European ancestry groups, that's totally uncool, right? And totally counter to the foundational principles of the NHS and so on. So these are problems that we urgently need to fix before they become realised kind of in the real world.
So, practically speaking, 2 questions. What does that actually look like? Is it proactively going out and finding people in those groups who otherwise wouldn't be a part of that data set? And secondly, how do you get to a large enough cohort that you can run? Because as we know, these technologies require very large data sets. Are you going to get that in those subpopulations?
Yeah, so I don't know how long we have, but I'm going to talk about this all day. I think it's a combination of things. One is, what are the scientific questions we're trying to answer that then helps you understand what level of power do we need for different sized cohorts and so on. The other is, what data sets do we already have across, in this country, Genomics England, UK Biobank, other assets. And therefore, where are the big gaps that we need to close in order to ensure equity of access? And that leads straight to, who are the communities that we need to engage with, listen to, work with, co-design programs with, to address, as Ben was saying earlier, the really legitimate concerns that many people have about how their data is used, how tissue's been used historically, what consent used to mean, what consent now means. We really need to work through this. Just one example, we did a big survey with Ipsos Mori about how people feel about their DNA data, what they're excited about, what they're worried about. The number one concern that came back was, I worry that if the government has my data, it'll be planted at a crime scene and I'll get convicted of a crime that I didn't commit. Partly that says to you, as a nation, we watch too much CSI Crime Scene, right? But it also reflects a staggering, not just lack of trust. It's not like, I think you're going to be idiots and someone's going to hack this and they're going to steal my data. No, you're going to proactively use my data to wreck my life, right? Wow, that's a lack of trust. So, we have a huge way to go from trust us, we're scientists, it's all cool, we're acting in your best interests, they're there, to actually, let's talk about this together. Let's be honest. Let's look in the face of some of the stuff that's happened historically. Let's think about what it would take to do something meaningful here together, and let's think about the downsides of not doing this together. Let's look into the face of not acting, as well as looking into the face of how we act. Yeah. I got off the soapbox.
Ben.
If I may add on this, I mean, this is hugely important. And I think what is important to realize that this is not just solved by data collection, right? So it's not just realizing there are underrepresented groups and let's get more data, right? So there's this idea of health data poverty, which is hugely important. But we have to realize that we're working on often historic data when it comes to AI, machine learning technology. And historic data will always have biases. So just collecting more data, let's say from an underrepresented group, isn't solving the problem, because that data might have different biases than the data from the majority group. Just to give an example from my own research at Imperial and also at Chiron, we're looking specifically into differences in subgroups that exhibit disparate performance when you use a machine learning model. So you might see different sensitivity specificity levels in different subgroups. And the importance is to understand, why are these disparities happening? Is it the model that maybe ignores certain traits from a certain subgroup? It's not picking up the right features. Or is it the data that is wrong, right? So as an example, you can, for instance, differentiate semantically, but very importantly, between underrepresentation and underdiagnosis or overdiagnosis in certain subgroups. We know that certain subgroups have a lack of trust in the healthcare system. They go to the doctor often later when the symptoms are much worse than in other subgroups. So what you might then find, if you just go and collect more data from those subgroups, that data is not representative, or it doesn't represent what it should in terms of symptomatic and diagnosis. And if you use that data to train a machine learning model, you're just baking in those biases into the model. So I think, in terms of going back to the question, where are we? I think that there's an urgent need for much more research into better understanding the causes of biases in these data sets. How do we disentangle them? And how do we mitigate them, right? How do we actually use the knowledge about biases to build better technology? So I think this aspect I can just re-emphasize how important it is, and how down to my own heart as a researcher this is.
I'd like to add to that as well. This is extremely important, and I think the one thing that we can do immediately is increase the transparency of the data sets that these technologies are being trained on. So at NICE, we would want to look at how they've been trained, what the biases are. That's very difficult because we're not getting access to the data sets or getting good descriptions of what populations have been put into those data sets, when that data was collected. As Ben says, there are historical biases. It's very difficult, therefore, to even start to understand what the biases, the known biases, might even be. So first step is transparency in the data sets that these technologies have been developed on.
It's when I'm sitting on a panel and say, I really want to follow up. So Jeanette, some of the funding that we've got is to develop open source tools for academic researchers, companies, to be able to report more easily on these kind of things. Would love to follow up with you guys on how we can deploy some of those.
Great, we're actually making stuff happen here.
Making connections happen.
And if I can be Mr. Brightside again,
yeah.
I would say that even flawed data sets, which is every data set, right? Even flawed data sets still have utility. So that my message to the AI community is just understand the data set that you're working with, understand its biases, its limitations, know the metadata, where did it come from, and then as Jeanette says, that has to be open and declared. But even if you understand those flaws, those data sets can still have enormous utility. I mean, UK Biobank being a fantastic example. So UK Biobank is a cohort of 500,000 people in the UK who've been studied and genotyped and phenotyped and followed over, 15 years now. Yeah. It's an incredible data resource. But, as Chris says, it's predominantly white, middle-aged and female. Because just those were the folks that volunteered to be part of it. And
they all live in Hampshire as well.
and because we understand the limitations of that set and don't, try and extrapolate beyond it, it's been one of the most valuable data resources in the UK for biomedical research.
And over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers published off the back of it, polygenic risk scores derived off the back of it. I mean, it's an extraordinary legacy. And as the leadership of UK Biobank would say as well, we need to continue to build out from that to get to a sort of fully representative set. So,
So as we're coming towards the end of the discussion, I'm going to riff on your comment. What would be each of your messages to the AI community? So a lot of people in the audience are deep into AI, looking at AI, starting out in AI. What are some areas that you would encourage them in healthcare and in early detection of disease, or wherever you want to take it, that you would encourage them to spend some time and look at?
I would say not just talk to, but listen to humans. It's easy for all of us to be in a sort of dark room with 3 or 4 big monitors, loads of code, loads of data. Get out, go into the street, go into a GP clinic, go into a hospital, ask people about whatever you're doing, whether that's medical imaging, whether it's early detection of cancer, whatever. Listen to them and really understand the human stories around this, because people who are working on big AI models will naturally be doing that. And I would say, challenge yourself to actually have those human interactions. Use your ears as much as your fingers.
Love it. Jeanette, how about you?
Agree with that. And building on it, I'd say work out what your value proposition is early. What are the benefits that technology is going to bring to the healthcare system, to patients? Where is it exactly going to be used? Who is it going to be used by? And then that will set the whole development plan and evidence generation and who you need to go and talk to. So think about value proposition. What benefits will it bring?
And Ben, any closing thoughts for the AI community?
Yes, I would maybe start with saying we should be grateful to the doctors that help us, grateful to the patients who often donate their data for our research, and listen to them. Listen to the doctors, what they really need in clinical practice, where are the pain points, where can we help them, and listen to the concerns. I think as AI developers, we are sometimes maybe not immediately thinking about the bigger impact our work might have. It has societal impact. It impacts people's lives, especially in healthcare. So listen to the concerns and then think about where it can go wrong, right? So don't always only think about the opportunities. It's important, but also think about where could it do harm and take that into account in the entire development cycle of AI.
David, with 1 minute to go.
Well, the first thing I'd like to say to the AI community is work on early detection of cancer. By far the most interesting problem that you'll have a go at, and the most impactful. But the second thing I'd say is the world is increasingly interested in not just what you're able to do, but how. And so, the kind of, I suppose, the black box AI models of the past that might just say, "Ooh, I found a disease." It's probably not going to be enough, and increasingly regulators, the healthcare system, and scientists are going to want to know what is it that you're finding and what's the model keying off.
Brilliant. Great. Well, thank you so much to all of our brilliant panellists, and I hope that you stick around and enjoy the rest of AI UK. Cheers.